In the spring of 1972, a journalist named Kevin Buckley sat down at a desk in the Newsweek bureau in Saigon and began working through a stack of documents that had taken him more than a year to collect. There were after-action reports, medical records, intelligence assessments, and the testimony of American soldiers, Vietnamese civilians, and military officials. When he finished reading, he wrote a memo to his editors in New York. The memo said, in essence, that the United States Army had killed thousands of Vietnamese civilians in the Mekong Delta between November 1968 and May 1969, had counted them as enemy dead, had awarded medals and commendations on the basis of those false counts, and had buried every piece of evidence that pointed toward the truth. His editors killed the story. They ran a shortened, heavily edited version in June 1972 that omitted the most damaging conclusions. The full investigation was never published. The Pentagon's internal inquiry, which reached conclusions that alarmed even the investigators who conducted it, was classified and filed away. And Operation Speedy Express, which may have produced more civilian casualties than any other single American military operation in Vietnam, remained almost entirely unknown to the American public for decades. To understand what happened in the Mekong Delta in the winter of 1968 and 1969, you have to understand the context in which it occurred. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 had shattered the American public's confidence in the war and shattered General William Westmoreland's career along with it. Westmoreland was replaced as commander of American forces in Vietnam by General Creighton Abrams in the summer of 1968. But before Abrams could implement his changes, the military he inherited was still operating under the doctrine that Westmoreland had built, a doctrine centered on attrition, on grinding down the enemy through superior firepower, and on measuring progress through a single metric that had come to dominate every level of the American military in Vietnam: the body count. In the absence of territorial gains, in a war without front lines where the same ground changed hands repeatedly, American commanders had settled on enemy dead as the primary measure of success. Units were evaluated on their kill ratios. Officers were promoted based on the numbers their units produced. Careers rose and fell on body counts. The pressure to produce high numbers flowed downward from MACV headquarters in Saigon, through corps and division commands, to brigade and battalion commanders, to company commanders, to the soldiers on the ground. Everyone in the system understood what was expected. The system rewarded high numbers and asked very few questions about how they had been produced. Into this system, in the fall of 1968, came Major General Julian Ewell. Ewell was given command of the 9th Infantry Division, which was responsible for military operations in the Mekong Delta, the flat, canal-crossed agricultural heartland of South Vietnam, south of Saigon. Ewell was known within the Army as a fierce and demanding commander. He was also known, among people who observed him closely, as a man who was obsessed with body counts to a degree that went beyond even the already distorted norms of the Vietnam-era military. Ewell set numerical targets. He told his brigade and battalion commanders what kill ratios he expected. He tracked the numbers personally and relentlessly. Officers who produced high numbers were praised and promoted. Officers who produced low numbers were relieved of command. The message was unambiguous: kill more people, report higher numbers, or find yourself reassigned. And so the 9th Infantry Division, under Operation Speedy Express, set about killing people in the Mekong Delta. The operational approach that produced the numbers was built around the massive application of firepower against areas designated as enemy-controlled or enemy-contested. Helicopter gunships, artillery, and tactical airstrikes were called in on targets across the Delta. The rules of engagement permitted fire on anyone in designated free-fire zones, areas where the civilian population was theoretically assumed to have been relocated. In practice, the free-fire zones of the Mekong Delta contained large numbers of civilians who had nowhere to go, who had farmed the same land for generations and could not or would not leave it, and who were now subject to being killed by American firepower and counted as enemy dead. The gap between the kill numbers and the weapons recovered was the first and most obvious sign that something was wrong. Over the 6 months of Operation Speedy Express, the 9th Infantry Division reported killing 10,899 enemy combatants. In the same period, 748 weapons were recovered. That is a ratio of roughly 1 weapon for every 14.5 people killed. In any honest military analysis, that ratio is impossible to explain if the dead were actually enemy soldiers. Enemy soldiers carry weapons. Dead enemy soldiers have weapons near them. A ratio of 1 weapon per 14 dead was not a sign of exceptionally effective combat operations. It was a sign that most of the people being killed were not soldiers. American military officials who looked at the numbers at the time did not ask that obvious question out loud, at least not in any forum where the question would produce consequences. The numbers were accepted, the commendations were issued, and General Ewell was awarded a second Distinguished Service Medal before leaving command in April 1969. He was widely regarded within the Army as one of the most effective commanders of the war. Kevin Buckley's investigation, which began in 1971, assembled the evidence that the official record had buried. He interviewed American soldiers who had served in the Delta during Speedy Express, and what they told him was specific and damning. One soldier described being ordered to report any Vietnamese male of military age found dead in a free-fire zone as a confirmed enemy kill, regardless of whether there was any evidence the person had been a combatant. Another described helicopter crews that competed with each other for kills, flying low over rice paddies and shooting at farmers who ran when they heard the aircraft. Running, in the operational logic of the Delta, was evidence of guilt. If you ran from an American helicopter, you could be shot. If you were shot, you were counted. A medical worker who had operated in the Delta during Speedy Express told Buckley that the civilian casualty figures she had witnessed at provincial hospitals were completely inconsistent with the official narrative of the operation. She described treating large numbers of civilians with wounds consistent with being shot from above, from helicopter altitude, in the open. Farmers, old men, women, children, not fighters ambushed in the jungle, people who had been in fields and on paths and in their homes when the helicopters came. The most significant documentary evidence came from an unexpected source: the operational records of the provincial reconnaissance units, the CIA-linked paramilitary forces operating in the Delta alongside the 9th Division. Those records, cross-referenced against 9th Division after-action reports, showed systematic patterns of inflation that suggested bodies were being counted multiple times, that civilians killed by artillery or airstrikes were being attributed to ground units as enemy kills, and that the command pressure for numbers had created a reporting system in which the numbers bore an increasingly tenuous relationship to anything that had actually happened on the ground. Buckley submitted his full findings to Newsweek in early 1972. His editors, mindful of the political environment and the legal exposure of publishing accusations of mass civilian killing against a named division and a named commander, significantly reduced the story before publication. The version that appeared in June 1972 was titled "Pacification's Deadly Price" and ran several pages in the magazine. It raised serious questions about civilian casualties in the Delta, but stopped well short of the conclusions Buckley's full investigation had reached. Even in its reduced form, it produced a significant response. The Army launched an Inspector General investigation. The investigation was conducted between late 1972 and early 1973, and it gathered testimony from dozens of soldiers who had served in the Delta during Speedy Express. What the investigators found alarmed them. They documented systematic inflation of body counts, credible evidence that civilians had been killed and counted as enemy, and a command culture under Ewell that had created overwhelming pressure to produce numbers regardless of what those numbers actually represented. The investigators concluded that the 9th Division's reported kill figures were significantly inflated and that a substantial but indeterminate number of the reported enemy dead were almost certainly civilians. The investigation report was classified. It was not shared with Congress. It was not released to the public. It was filed in Army records and forgotten. The Army took no action against General Ewell, who had already retired. No officer who served under him during Speedy Express was disciplined. No soldier who had reported false body counts faced any consequence. The report that confirmed what Buckley's investigation had found was locked in a drawer, and the drawer stayed shut for decades. The person who eventually pried it open was a historian named Nick Terse. Terse spent years in the National Archives, going through boxes of records from Vietnam-era Army criminal investigations, Inspector General reports, and unit operational files. What he found, documented in his 2013 book Kill Anything That Moves, was that Operation Speedy Express was not an anomaly. It was an example of a pattern that ran across the entire American military in Vietnam, a pattern of civilian killing that was systematically concealed through false reporting, command pressure, and institutional indifference. Terce's reconstruction of Operation Speedy Express drew on the classified IG report, on Buckley's unpublished notes, on provincial hospital records, on testimony from Vietnamese survivors gathered decades after the fact, and on the operational records of the units involved. His conclusion was that the actual number of civilians killed during Speedy Express was likely in the thousands, not hundreds, thousands. Some estimates, based on cross-referencing multiple data sources, suggested that civilian deaths during the operation may have been comparable in scale to My Lai, not as a single incident, but as an accumulated total across 6 months of operations. The difference between My Lai and Speedy Express in terms of public knowledge and accountability is stark and revealing. My Lai happened in a single day and was witnessed by a photographer whose images made concealment impossible once the photographs were published. Speedy Express happened over 6 months, spread across a large operational area, conducted largely through air and artillery rather than by soldiers on the ground with rifles. There were no photographs of individual moments of killing. There was no Hugh Thompson in a helicopter above the Delta, pointing his crew at American gunships. There was no single incident around which accountability could crystallize. There was just the ratio: 1 weapon for every 14.5 dead, and a classified report in a drawer. The soldiers who carried out the operations that produced those numbers were, in most cases, not the architects of what happened. They were young men operating under command pressure in a system that rewarded killing and asked no questions about who was being killed. Several veterans of the 9th Division who spoke to researchers in later years described the experience of serving under Ewell's command culture as something that had profoundly damaged them. Not because they were ordered to commit atrocities in the explicit way that Calley had ordered his men to kill at My Lai, but because the system they operated in made atrocity routine and invisible. The helicopter gunner who shot at a running figure in a rice paddy was following the rules as he understood them. The officer who counted the body as an enemy kill was responding to command pressure as he experienced it. The general who set the numerical targets and drove the culture that produced them received a medal. The Vietnamese civilians who died during Operation Speedy Express have never been counted, acknowledged, or memorialized by the United States government. Their deaths do not appear in any official American accounting of the war's casualties. The villages in the Mekong Delta where their families lived do not appear in any American after-action reports as sites of civilian loss. They were counted once, as enemy dead, in reports that were used to justify commendations and career advancement. And then they were forgotten. Kevin Buckley left Vietnam in 1972 and spent the rest of his career in journalism. He never published the full version of his investigation. The notes and documents from his research eventually found their way into archives where researchers like Terce could access them decades later. Buckley gave interviews about the story in his later years. He said the thing that stayed with him was not the numbers, but a specific conversation he had with a province official during his reporting. The official told him that the Americans had come to help and instead had turned the Delta into a killing ground. He said the people in the villages didn't understand the difference between being killed by the enemy and being killed by their allies. Dead was dead. Julian Ewell died in 2009. His obituaries in military publications described him as a distinguished combat commander and one of the most effective generals of the Vietnam era. Operation Speedy Express was not mentioned. The ratio is still there. 1 weapon for every 14.5 dead. The mathematics of what happened in the Mekong Delta in the winter of 1968 and 1969 have never been officially acknowledged, never been apologized for, and never been fully explained. The report that confirmed what happened is available now in the National Archives, declassified, accessible, sitting in a box alongside thousands of other documents from a war that the United States has never fully reckoned with. The drawer is open. The question is whether anyone is willing to look. There is a video on screen right now that goes deeper into the hidden history of American military operations in Vietnam, and if this story made you angry, it should. Subscribe. The histories that were buried are the ones that matter most.